I was always upfront about not wanting kids. From day 3 of dating Rodney, I made it crystal clear, no children, ever, and if that was going to be a problem, we should end things right then. He claimed he was totally fine with it, said it was refreshing to meet a woman who knew what she wanted, instead of those basic girls who just assume every relationship leads to babies and white picket fences. What a load of crap that turned out to be. Rodney seemed different from the start, more mature than the guys I usually dated. He had his own place, a decent job, and he didn't spend his weekends getting wasted with his buddies like some overgrown frat boy. When we'd go out, he actually listened when I talked about my career goals and my plans to travel. I thought I'd finally found someone who understood that there's more to life than breeding and settling into suburban mediocrity. Those first few months were pretty great. Actually, we'd spend entire weekends in bed, order takeout, watch movies without some screaming kid interrupting every 5 minutes. I'd see my friends struggling with their toddlers, looking exhausted and defeated. And I'd think about how smart I was to avoid all that drama. Rodney seemed to enjoy our freedom too. We could be spontaneous, go out whenever we wanted, spend our money on ourselves instead of diapers and daycare. But even during our dating period, I started noticing these little comments he'd make. We'd be walking through the mall and pass some family with a baby, and he'd get this weird look on his face, or we'd be at his brother's house for dinner, and he'd spend way too much time playing with their kids. I'd catch him watching me when I interacted with children, like he was waiting for some maternal switch to flip. It was annoying as hell, but I figured he'd get over it once we got married and settled into real life. The wedding was beautiful, I made sure of that. Small ceremony, just close family and friends. Exactly what I wanted. Rodney seemed happy enough. Though his mother made a few pointed comments about grandchildren that I chose to ignore, I was too busy enjoying being the center of attention and planning our honeymoon to worry about his family's expectations. The first year of marriage was rougher than I expected. Suddenly, Rodney had all these opinions about how we should spend our time and money. He wanted to buy a bigger house for the future, whatever that meant. He'd bring up retirement planning and life insurance like we were some boring middle-aged couple instead of young people who should be enjoying ourselves. We fought about stupid stuff constantly. Whose turn it was to do dishes. Whether we needed a joint savings account. Why I wanted to spend money on clothes when we could be building our nest egg. I started to wonder if I'd made a mistake marrying him. The fun, easygoing guy I dated had turned into this nagging husband who questioned every purchase I made and wanted to have serious talks about our 5-year plan. What the hell happened to just living in the moment? I felt like he was trying to turn me into his mother or something, all responsible and domestic. That wasn't the deal we'd made. Things got even worse when I accidentally got pregnant. In early 2020, I was on the pill, but I'd been sick with food poisoning, and apparently that screwed with the effectiveness. When I saw those 2 lines on the test, I felt like my whole world was collapsing. This was exactly what I'd spent years trying to avoid. Some parasite growing inside me, ruining my body, trapping me in a life I never wanted. Rodney's reaction was the complete opposite. When I told him, he got this stupid grin on his face and started talking about cribs and baby names, like this was some wonderful surprise instead of a complete disaster. He kept saying things like everything happens for a reason, and maybe this is the universe telling us something. I wanted to scream at him that the universe was telling us my birth control had failed, not that we should become parents. The pregnancy was absolute hell. I was sick constantly, exhausted all the time, and my body felt like it wasn't my own anymore. Rodney kept trying to be supportive, bringing me crackers and ginger ale, but he had this annoying excitement that made everything worse. He'd put his hand on my barely there bump and talk about how our lives were going to change, how amazing it would be to have a little person who was part of both of us. Meanwhile, I was researching what having a baby would do to my career, my body, our finances. None of it looked good. I started drinking wine again around week 8, just a glass here and there to take the edge off. Nothing crazy. Rodney would give me these looks when he caught me, but I'd remind him that plenty of European women drink during pregnancy and their kids turn out fine. I also kept up my usual workout routine, maybe pushed myself a little harder than normal. If my body was going to be wrecked anyway, I might as well try to maintain some control over it. When I miscarried at 10 weeks, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. Finally, I could get back to my normal life, back to being myself instead of some vessel for a future person I'd never wanted. But Rodney completely fell apart. He cried more than I'd ever seen a grown man cry, kept asking what we could have done differently, whether it was his fault somehow. The way he grieved was honestly embarrassing. He wanted to have some kind of memorial service for a fetus that was barely bigger than a lime. He kept talking about our baby like we'd lost an actual child instead of a cluster of cells that my body had rejected. I tried to be supportive, but inside I was thinking that this was probably for the best. Clearly, neither of us was ready for parenthood if this was how he handled a completely natural biological process. His family was even worse. His mother kept making these pointed comments about how I should have been more careful, how I should have stopped working out, how maybe I wasn't taking proper care of myself. Like it was my fault that my body did what it was supposed to do when it wasn't ready to support a pregnancy. I could tell she blamed me, which was rich coming from someone who'd had 3 easy pregnancies and acted like childbirth was some kind of spiritual experience. After the miscarriage, our marriage actually improved a lot. Rodney seemed to accept that kids weren't in our future, at least not anytime soon. We got back to enjoying each other's company, traveling on weekends, focusing on our careers. I thought we'd finally gotten past all the domestic drama and settled into being the power couple I'd always envisioned us becoming. But I could tell something had changed in him. He was quieter, more distant sometimes. He'd get this far-off look when we'd pass families in public, like he was thinking about what we'd lost. It was frustrating because I'd moved on completely, but he seemed stuck in this grief cycle that served no purpose. We couldn't change what had happened, and honestly, we were better off without the stress and expense of a child we weren't ready for. Around early 2022, I started getting messages from Dawson, my ex from college. We dated for about a year back then, and he'd been incredible, smart, funny, amazing in bed, the kind of guy who could make you forget about everything else when you were with him. We'd broken up when he moved across the country for work, but we'd stayed in touch sporadically over the years through social media. His messages started innocently enough, just catching up, asking about my life, sharing funny memories from our college days. But pretty quickly, they turned more personal. He'd tell me how beautiful I looked in my recent photos, how he sometimes wondered what would have happened if we'd stayed together. I found myself looking forward to his texts, checking my phone constantly to see if he'd written back. Rodney was usually working late or watching TV when I'd text with Dawson, so it was easy to keep our conversations private. We'd talk about everything, our jobs, our relationships, our regrets. Dawson was going through a rough patch with his wife, and I was dealing with Rodney's post-miscarriage weirdness, so we had a lot to bond over. It felt good to talk to someone who really understood me, who remembered the person I used to be before I got trapped in suburban married life. The conversations gradually became more intimate. Dawson would tell me how much he missed being with me, how his wife didn't understand him the way I had. I'd complain about Rodney's emotional distance, how he'd changed from the fun guy I'd married into this serious, brooding husband who couldn't seem to get over something that had happened 2 years ago. Dawson would remind me of how passionate we'd been together, how we could talk for hours about anything and everything. I knew it was probably crossing some lines, but it wasn't like I was actually cheating. We were just talking, reminiscing, providing emotional support for each other. Rodney was so wrapped up in his own issues that he barely noticed I was spending more time on my phone. And honestly, after years of dealing with his moods and expectations, it was refreshing to talk to someone who appreciated me for who I actually was. Then Dawson told me about his diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Maybe 2 years to live if he was lucky. His wife had already started pulling away, talking about how she couldn't handle watching him die, how she needed to protect herself emotionally. I was devastated for him. Here was this amazing man, still young, still full of life, and he was facing death while married to someone who was already abandoning him. We started talking every day after that. Dawson would tell me about his treatments, his fears, his regrets about all the things he'd never get to do. I found myself thinking about him constantly, wishing I could do something to help, to make his remaining time meaningful. He'd hint about how lonely he was, how his wife barely touched him anymore, how he felt like he was already dead to everyone who was supposed to love him. The more we talked, the more I realized how much I'd missed having that kind of deep connection with someone. Rodney and I barely communicated beyond logistics anymore. Who was picking up groceries, what bills needed to be paid, what we were watching on Netflix. But Dawson and I could talk for hours about philosophy, about dreams, about what really mattered in life. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. When Dawson finally brought up the possibility of us being together, I wasn't even surprised. He said he'd been thinking about me constantly, about how different his life might have been if we'd stayed together. He wasn't asking me to leave Rodney or anything dramatic like that. He just wanted to experience real passion one more time before he died. He wanted to feel loved and desired, to remember what it was like to be with someone who truly understood him. I knew it was complicated, but how could I say no to a dying man's last wish? This wasn't some sordid affair. This was about compassion, about giving someone I cared about a beautiful memory to carry him through his final months. Dawson had maybe 2 years left, and his own wife had basically abandoned him. If I could provide some comfort and joy during his darkest time, wasn't that the right thing to do? The problem was Rodney. I knew he wouldn't understand the situation, wouldn't see past his own jealousy to recognize what this really was. He'd probably react like a typical possessive husband instead of the mature, compassionate partner I needed him to be. But I also knew I couldn't just sneak around behind his back. That would be actual cheating, and I wasn't that kind of person. So I decided to be completely honest with him. I waited for a quiet evening when we were both home. No distractions. And I explained the whole situation. I told him about Dawson's diagnosis, about how his wife was failing him, about how he just wanted to feel loved one more time before he died. I explained that this wasn't about our marriage or my commitment to Rodney. It was about basic human compassion. If you really love me, you'll let me do this for him. I said, he's dying. Rodney, his wife has already given up on him. I might be the only person who can give him some peace and happiness in his final months. I expected him to be upset at first. That would be natural. But I thought once he had time to process it, he'd understand that this was bigger than his ego or his insecurities. I was asking for permission, being completely transparent, showing him the respect he deserved as my husband. This wasn't some sneaky affair. This was an act of mercy for someone who was suffering. But Rodney's reaction was nothing like what I'd expected. He didn't get angry or jealous. He just looked at me with this cold, calm expression and said, "You can sleep with as many ex-boyfriends as you want. Christina, you're about to be single." I was completely stunned. This wasn't how the conversation was supposed to go. He was supposed to be upset, maybe even hurt. But then we were supposed to work through it together like mature adults. Instead, he was acting like I'd asked him for a divorce, instead of just trying to help a dying friend. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "Rodney, this isn't about us. This is about doing something kind for someone who's suffering." But he was already walking away, telling me he had some phone calls to make. I followed him, trying to explain that he was overreacting, that we could work through this if he'd just listened to me. But he went into his office and closed the door, leaving me standing in the hallway feeling like I was in some alternate reality. Over the next few days, Rodney barely spoke to me. He'd answer direct questions with 1 or 2 words, but otherwise he acted like I wasn't even there. I tried to bring up our conversation several times, but he'd just say he was handling things and walk away. I figured he was processing his emotions and would eventually come around to understanding my perspective. I kept texting with Dawson during this time, letting him know that I was working on the situation with Rodney. Dawson was so grateful that I was willing to fight for him, to risk my marriage to give him some happiness in his final time. He kept telling me how much it meant to him that someone still cared enough to make sacrifices for his well-being. A week after our conversation, I was at work when a process server showed up at my office. In front of all my coworkers, this guy handed me divorce papers and asked me to sign a receipt. I was so humiliated I could barely think straight. Everyone was staring, whispering, probably assuming I was some cheating wife who'd finally gotten caught. I called Rodney immediately, furious about the public embarrassment he'd caused me. "How dare you embarrass me like this?" I said when he picked up. "Do you know how humiliating it is to be served at work? My coworkers think I'm some kind of criminal. You should have thought about that before you asked permission to cheat on me," he said, and then he hung up. I tried calling back several times, but he wouldn't answer. I drove straight home, but he wasn't there. And when I tried his office, they said he'd taken some personal time. It was like he'd just disappeared, leaving me to deal with this mess by myself. When I finally reached him a few days later, I tried to explain that he was completely overreacting, that we could fix this if he'd just calm down and think rationally. "We can fix this." "Rodney," I said, "we can go to counseling. Don't throw everything away over one mistake." But he wasn't interested in counseling or fixing anything. He'd already moved out of our house and into some temporary apartment. He'd closed our joint accounts and hired a lawyer. In the span of 1 week, he'd completely dismantled our entire life together, all because I'd tried to do something compassionate for a dying friend. The divorce proceedings were a nightmare. Rodney's lawyer had somehow gotten copies of all my text messages with Dawson, including the more intimate ones from before I'd asked for permission. They tried to make it look like I'd been having an emotional affair for months, completely ignoring the context of the situation. They painted me as some manipulative cheater instead of a caring person who'd been providing emotional support to someone who was suffering. At one of the hearings, I tried to make Rodney understand what he was doing to us. "Please, Rodney, don't do this," I said. "I'll change. I promise I'll be the wife you want me to be." But he just looked at me with those same cold eyes and said, "You already had your chance. I'm done." The judge seemed to buy into Rodney's victim narrative completely, even though I'd been honest about everything. Even though I'd asked for permission instead of sneaking around, they treated me like I was the villain in this situation. I lost the house even though my name was on the mortgage. The settlement was much smaller than I'd expected. Rodney got to walk away looking like the wronged husband, while I was left picking up the pieces of a life he'd destroyed. The worst part was how he completely cut me out of his life afterward. No contact, no closure, no opportunity to explain my side of things. Our mutual friends got his version of events, of course, so I had to deal with people looking at me like I was some heartless cheater who'd destroyed a good marriage. Nobody wanted to hear about the context, about how I'd been trying to help someone who was dying, about how I'd been honest instead of sneaking around. Now, 2 years later, Rodney seems perfectly content with his new life. I see his social media sometimes. He's dating casually, traveling, looking happier than he ever did with me. He's told people he's never getting married again, that he values his peace and freedom too much. It's like our entire relationship meant nothing to him. Like he was just waiting for an excuse to bail out and go back to being a selfish bachelor. Meanwhile, I'm still dealing with the aftermath of his dramatic overreaction. I had to start over completely. New apartment, new social circle, rebuilding my finances from scratch. And for what? Because I tried to show compassion to someone who was facing death. Because I was honest about my feelings instead of lying and sneaking around like most people would have done. The thing that really gets me is how everyone acts like Rodney was this perfect husband who got betrayed. But they didn't live with him. They didn't see how he changed after the miscarriage, how he became distant and moody and impossible to please. They didn't see how he'd rather destroy our entire marriage than show a little understanding for someone else's suffering. They just see this calm, rational guy who did what he had to do when his wife betrayed him. But I know the truth. Rodney was looking for an excuse to end our marriage, and I handed it to him by being too honest. If I'd just kept my mouth shut and handled the situation privately, we'd probably still be together. Instead, I trusted him to be mature and compassionate. And he used my honesty as a weapon against me. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just gone ahead and slept with Dawson without asking permission. At least then, I would have gotten something out of this whole mess instead of losing everything for nothing. Dawson ended up dying about 18 months after our divorce was finalized. Alone and bitter because the people who claimed to love him abandoned him when he needed them most. That's the real tragedy here. Not that my marriage ended, but that a good man died without getting to experience love and passion one last time because my husband was too selfish and insecure to let me show basic human kindness. Rodney gets to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life, knowing that his jealousy prevented a dying man from finding some peace and happiness in his final months. But I guess that's just who Rodney really was underneath all the nice guy pretense, someone who would rather see people suffer than risk his own comfort. I'm probably better off without him, even if it took me a while to realize it. At least now I know what I'm dealing with when it comes to people's true character. Most people talk a good game about love and commitment, but when it comes down to actually making sacrifices for others, they show their real colors pretty quickly.